Do you think you know Gollum? That strange creature with bulging eyes and a whispered speech that only repeated precious? Well, maybe everything you've been told about him is just the tip of the spear, because behind that grotesque figure lies a deep tragedy, a soul slowly corrupted, not by an enemy, but by itself. Gollum wasn't born a monster. He was a hobbit. He had a family, a home, even quiet birthdays. And in the blink of an eye, everything turned to dust. This is the story that Tolkien never shouted in the halls of Rohan, nor sang on elven flutes. It's the tale of a character no one wanted to love, yet who carries the pain we all fear to feel. Forget about good versus evil. This is about what happens when desire overpowers reason, and when loneliness becomes mightier than any sword. And yes, there's much more of us in Gollum than we'd like to admit. In every wrong decision, every shadowy step, every seemingly small choice that cracked open huge fissures. He lost himself, or was he pushed? The truth is that understanding Gollum's fall means understanding what happens to any one of us when we stop keeping an eye on what dwells inside. And here, you're about to discover it all. From the innocent days in the golden fields to the moment he clutched Middle-earth's fate in a single bite. Get ready, because this isn't just a story of Middle-earth. It's a mirror, a warning, and perhaps a chance to start over. Few know, but before he became the Gollum that haunts the corridors of our imagination, he was just a curious hobbit named Trahald. That's right, a stoor from a sturdier lineage and a lover of riverbanks, born around the year 2430 in the Golden Fields. He grew up among hills, secrets and silences under the leadership of a matriarchal grandmother who ruled like she knew it all. He was the type to take things apart just to understand how they worked, you know. If you've ever dismantled a remote control out of curiosity, then you get the spirit of Smeagol. Environment shapes the mind, and when it comes to Middle-earth, that was never just a saying. Smeagol, unlike the traditional hobbits of the Shire, had an inner crack from knowing too much. He was the kind of mind that wasn't satisfied with the surface of things. If Tolkien taught us anything, it's that curiosity can be a blessing or a curse, depending on what you uncover when you dig into the unknown. One day, that yearning to know more would open an irreparable rift. Trahald, later known as Smeagol, had a very sensitive connection with the unseen, that which the eyes can't see but the heart senses. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to carry something different from an early age? I'm not talking about mystical powers, but that restless urge that drives someone to seek what others ignore. Gollum was born in the margins of this desire to understand what no one else wanted to see. And let's face it, that's a lot like the journey of many geniuses, or many damned souls. No matter how rich and influential his family was, it never shielded him from the inner void that called him away. And that's curious, because even today, some people think money and a solid family structure are enough to keep someone on the right path. But Smeagol was living proof that our inner world always speaks louder. Just like so many of Tolkien's characters, he shows us that there are forces greater than logic, forces that whisper in the dark of the soul. In those days, the winds of Middle-earth were already blowing change. And while the Shire lived in its simplicity, on other edges of the world, something ancient began to stir. Gollum, still in his initial form as Smeagol, was already a harbinger that something was coming. Because when curiosity meets power, a new kind of creature is born. And sometimes, what seems like an innocent question can lead us straight into the abyss. Birthdays should be a time of joy, right? But for Smeagol, it was the beginning of the end. On the very day he completed another year of life, he received a gift, and what a gift! His cousin Déagol found a golden ring deep in the river, gleaming and silent like it guarded an ancient secret. One look was enough, one desire, and just like that, Gollum was born with an act that blended greed, fascination, and tragedy. Murder of Déagol wasn't just a crime. It was the first step toward a transformation that no one could have foreseen, not even Smeagol himself. The ring, forged by Sauron and imbued with the essence of control, knew how to choose its bearer, and in this case, it didn't choose by strength, but by weakness. It fed off the inner crack that already existed in the Hobbit, and between you and me, that still happens today, with addictions, ambitions, and desires that silently consume. Slowly, the effects of the ring spread like poison. It wasn't all at once, and perhaps that's the most frightening part. Gollum took shape over time, in every whisper of possessiveness, in every isolation, in every guttural sigh. His very nickname came from the sound he made while breathing, Gollum, Gollum, a sound that over time replaced his name, his story, and his identity. When you stop and think, how many people today do you know who also lost themselves by letting something consume them? Smeagol's family, noticing his transformation, cast him out. He was banished, rejected, treated as a shadow of what he once was. And that point is important. Isolation might seem like punishment, but in truth it was the push that sent him into the abyss. Without bonds, without names, without direction, the Hobbit completely surrendered to the ring. It was him and the precious, as he began to call it. An abusive relationship in its purest and most mystical form, as only Tolkien could create. From that point on, there was no turning back. Corruption had taken root, and the outside world no longer made sense to Gollum. Middle-earth kept spinning, but he was already in a different orbit, an orbit made of darkness, whispers, and false promises. And it was in that state, half creature, half memory, that he began to vanish from the world's eyes, descending step by step into the abyss. After his expulsion, Gollum disappeared from the map as if one were blowing out a candle. He vanished, among rocks, caverns, and murmurs, until he found a deep refuge in the misty mountains. There, where the sun never touches and time dissolves like fog, he found the perfect place to hide from the world and from himself. What was Smeagol slowly faded away like ink in cold water. Gollum, now complete, began to reign in the darkness. It's curious to think that what many call a refuge can turn into a prison. Gollum spent centuries in that hole, eating raw fish and, every now and then, a distracted goblin. Yes, you read that right, goblins. And you know what's more disturbing? He not only survived, he lived there in total dependence on the ring. Tolkien makes it clear, loneliness, when combined with obsession, creates monsters, inside and out. Meanwhile, the ring did its job masterfully. It extended his life like a thin but sturdy thread. Gollum was no longer just a hobbit missing his home. He was a creature deformed inside and out, poisoned by the promise of power. And even far from the eyes of Middle-earth, his heart still burned for the possession of the precious. That little word spoken with so much affection, like a toxic love that never leaves. This stage of the story teaches us something brutal but necessary. Not all isolation is rest. Gollum is a grim reminder that running away doesn't solve what gnaws at you inside. Do you know someone who hides behind work, social media, or distractions to avoid facing their own pain? Well, we all have our caves. The difference lies in what we choose to do inside them. Some meditate, others lose their minds, and while Middle-earth kept dancing through its ages and realms, there he was, forgetting his own reflection, trading light for whispers. But nothing stays buried forever, not even in the depths of a mountain. Gollum, unknowingly, still had a role to play, and that role would take shape years later when a certain hobbit named Bilbo Baggins crossed his path. It happened by chance, or perhaps by the design of destiny itself, that Gollum crossed paths with Bilbo Baggins. During his journey in The Hobbit, Frodo's uncle ended up lost in the depths of the misty mountains, and there, amidst shadows and enigmas, he came face to face with the creature forgotten by time. It was the meeting of two eras, the old, corrupted by the ring, and the new, still innocent. And there, in that game of riddles, the thread of history was sewn with precision by Tolkien. Bilbo, with the cleverness of a true Shire hobbit, ended up winning the game. But that wasn't what changed everything. It was the innocent theft of the ring, which slipped from Gollum's finger and ended up in the hands of someone who shouldn't have had it. Imagine, centuries of obsession snatched away in a careless moment. The pain, the hatred, and the despair. Gollum felt at that moment echoed louder than 1,000 war drums. It was as if a piece of his soul had been torn away, and from there, a new obsession was born. Gollum left his dark home and began a silent quest that would last for decades. He tracked, whispered, and crawled all over Middle-earth, guided by one certainty: the little thief from the Shire has my precious. And it wasn't paranoia, it was real. It was this search that eventually led him straight into Sauron's clutches, where he was captured and mercilessly tortured for information about the ring. And here comes an important point. Even the most twisted creatures can be central pieces on a much larger board. Gollum, even when broken, uttered two words that changed everything: Baggins and Shire. And that's what caught the Dark Lord's eye. Sometimes the one you least expect is the one who holds the keys to the next chapter. Ever thought about that? How many times do we underestimate someone who seems out of the game? Time passed, kingdoms moved, and the quest for the ring became the center of attention. But Gollum, he remained there, crawling at the edges of history, amidst shadows and promises. And when the Fellowship of the Ring was formed, bearing the mission to destroy the ring in Mordor, guess who started following their steps? That's right, him. Always him. Because as long as there's a spark of hope, there will also be a whisper saying precious. By this point, Gollum was nothing more than a spectre of flesh and bone, yet with senses honed and a resilience that would make any warrior envious. That's how Aragorn found him, or rather, hunted him down. Following nearly imperceptible traces, he captured the creature and took him to the realm of Thranduil, deep within the elven forests. There, under the watchful eyes of the elves and the keen mind of Gandalf, Gollum was interrogated. Not with cruelty, but with a certain sadness, as if observing someone who was once so much more than they are now. Gandalf understood something essential. Within Gollum, there still existed a fragment of Smeagol, a wisp of consciousness, of memory, of history. And it was that realization that made everything so much more complex. After all, what do you do when your enemy isn't just a monster, but also a victim? How many times in the real world do we deal with people broken by wrong choices yet still carrying a spark of humanity? Tolkien wasn't just writing fantasy, he was writing mirrors. Even so, security was a priority. And let's face it, keeping Gollum locked up wasn't an easy task. He was slippery as a shadow in the mist, and as the old saying of Middle-earth goes, what lives in the dark learns to escape the light. It was during an orc attack that chaos erupted. Amid spears, screams, and confusion, Gollum vanished once more. Perhaps by luck, perhaps by the manipulation of greater forces. The truth is, in that silent war over the ring, every move was calculated. Some say that Sauron had a hand in it, that the orc attack was all too opportune, at the exact moment when the elves were vulnerable. And it makes sense. After all, Sauron knew that Gollum could either guide his enemies or hinder them. He was an unstable piece on the board, and pieces like that are sometimes intentionally left free, like in chess, where a lone pawn can become a queen or cause chaos. And so, like a mist that disappears among the trees, Gollum returned to the world, Free, wounded, but more determined than ever. Now he knew exactly where to look, and his steps led him to where history burned like hidden embers, toward the Fellowship of the Ring. His journey was far from over, and the game was about to change again. There he was again, Gollum, the eternal wanderer of the shadows. After escaping the elves, fate led him into the depths of Moria, that place where silence weighs heavy and echoes tell forgotten tales. It was there that he resumed tracking the ring's trail, following the Fellowship almost instinctively, as if the precious called out to him through the stones. Tolkien shows us that some bonds never break. They merely sleep until the next fever. When he was finally captured by Frodo and Sam, Gollum was more beast than creature. But something happened. Frodo, with a sensitivity reminiscent of Smeagol's old days, saw beyond the ugliness and the fear. He offered a choice, a vow, and Gollum then swore loyalty to the master of the precious, and it was there that the tension between what he was and what he had become began to truly bleed, because the struggle within him never ceased. Smeagol and Gollum, two names, one body. This inner duality wasn't just narrative, it was pure psychology. Anyone who has faced addictions, traumas, or even a self-destructive inner voice understands. Gollum talked to himself, argued, and hurled words as weapons. He was a grim mirror of the battle between light and dark within all of us. Tolkien, with his mastery, turned this inner war into one of Middle-earth's greatest lessons. And between us, who hasn't had a Gollum whispering in their ear? Even so, he became a guide. He led Frodo and Sam through paths no one else dared traverse. He knew Mordor like the back of his hand, its shortcuts, its dangers, its traps. And amid rocks and swamps, the trio pressed on. But Gollum, he wasn't just walking with his feet. He was treading a mental battlefield where every step could mean a return to darkness or a new beginning as Smeagol. That tension hung heavily in the air. Frodo believed in him. Sam doubted every sigh, and in the midst of it all, Gollum walked like a tightrope over an abyss. One misstep, and everything would crumble. But could someone so fragmented really hold onto a promise? As they advanced through Mordor's shadows, something stirred, something ancient, hungry, something with many legs. Trust, that rare currency in Middle-earth. Frodo offered it to Gollum on a silver platter, and for a brief moment, Smeagol seemed to gain ground within him. But old wounds don't heal easily, and the temptation of the ring was an open wound that never closed. Gollum began to scheme in the shadows, silently, like someone whispering poison in a dark chamber. And where there is betrayal, there is always a stage set, a stage that in this case was Shelob's lair. Shelob wasn't just any creature. She was a living nightmare, a remnant of Middle-earth's darkest times. Gollum knew her well, counting on her ancient hunger to solve his little problem with Frodo and Sam. After all, if the master died, the precious would come back. To him, right? This kind of twisted reasoning is common when the mind no longer distinguishes desire from reality. And here, Tolkien shows how obsession becomes a trap. He led them through dark passages, lied sweetly, and manipulated with finesse. It was almost theatrical, a silent performance among the stones, while danger crept through the webs. And between us, how many times in the real world are we also led by someone who claims to be a friend, yet is only laying the groundwork to bring us down? Gollum's story is a reminder that not every companionship is protection. The plan failed. Frodo was attacked, yes, but survived thanks to Sam's courage, who, by the way, was the true hero in many moments of that journey. Shelob was injured and retreated, and Gollum vanished into the shadows once more. He didn't die, but he didn't win either. He was left on the fringes again, and as always, waiting for the right moment to reappear. Waiting for the precious, even betrayed, beaten, and abandoned by his own choices. Gollum didn't give up. It was a vicious cycle. Obsession, fall, re-emergence. And now, with Frodo and Sam ever closer to Mordor's heart, he knew his last chance was coming. Because in the end, it wasn't just a battle between good and evil. It was a contest between what remained of Smeagol and what was left of Gollum. The summit of Mount Doom wasn't just a geographical place. It was the stage for all the silent decisions, for all the inner voices that whisper while the world waits. Frodo, exhausted, wounded, and consumed, reached it with a clear mission to destroy the ring. But at the final second, power prevailed. He couldn't resist. The same Shire boy, once pure and determined, had become yet another prisoner of the precious. And Tolkien shows us once again that even the best among us can fall. It was then that Gollum emerged, not as a villain, but as destiny. He didn't speak, negotiate, or hesitate. He attacked Frodo like a starving animal, driven by the most primal instinct, bite after bite, until he tore off the finger. Yes, he tore off Frodo's finger, and at last the ring was back in his hands. And in that moment he danced. He danced like a child reunited with their favorite toy. It was joy and madness, all at once. But the joy was short-lived. In the midst of his ecstasy, Gollum stumbled, slipped, and fell into the lava. With the ring, with everything. That was when the great victory occurred, not through heroism, but by accident. An accident born of years of obsession, pain, and crooked choices. It's almost poetic. Gollum destroyed the ring not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't let go of what he loved most. And ironically, that's what saved Middle-earth. Gandalf had said long before that Gollum would still have a crucial role to play. And he did, in his own way, neither hero nor villain, just a being molded by forces he couldn't resist. And that teaches us something powerful. Every person has a purpose, even when they seem lost. Sometimes it's precisely the one discarded by everyone who holds the key to change. And Gollum, well, Gollum held the fate of the world in his misshapen hand. The lava swallowed everything. The ring, the past, the name, and Gollum finally found peace, or at least the silence he had long sought in his dark caverns. But his story would echo for centuries, as an unsettling reminder, as a scar on time. And maybe looking back, the real question isn't who was Gollum, but rather how many Gollums live today, trapped in their own mountains of desire. And now that you know the true story of Gollum, what are you going to do with it? Because look, this wasn't just a tale about Middle-earth, nor simply another epic narrative by Tolkien. It was a deep dive into the human soul, into our hidden desires, into the impulses we try to ignore, into the parts of us we call Smeagol. But that can turn into Gollum if we're not careful. How many times have you held on so tightly that you ended up being consumed by it? It might have been a relationship, a silent addiction, a goal that stopped being a dream and became a prison. Gollum is the living reminder that it's not just about what we have, but about what we're willing to lose to keep it. The question is, are you really seeing your own precious for what they are? So if this content stirred something in you, even if it's just a nagging thought, use it. Reflect, share, discuss. Carry this story forward, because the more people understand what really happened to Gollum, the fewer will have to live the same tragedy in silence. And of course, if you want to keep uncovering the hidden backstories of Middle-earth, the human layers behind the legends, and the secrets that only those who truly dive in can see, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because here, every story holds far more than the books ever told. And the journey is just beginning.